Hello and welcome back. Today we are going to be doing another Civilization 7 tier list, this time for the wonders of the ancient era. Before we get into it, we just want to make 3 points. First of all, we will not be evaluating the opportunity cost of building these wonders in terms of how we are thinking of them. So the wonders that are of the more early age, we are not going to be considering that you will have to get later settles in order to beat the deity AI in order to get these, or research suboptimal civics, and we are also not going to think of stuff in terms of, is this more valuable per production, because there are different production costs across the wonders. We are just looking at the wonders themselves. Also, we are looking at the wonders from an ageless perspective, how good they are going to be over the course of an entire game, not just in the ancient era. So something like the Great Stele, which is excellent in the ancient era and that kind of doesn't do much stuff afterwards, is going to be rated accordingly to the entire span of the game across the 3 ages, or at least 3 ages right now. And also, we are going to be just wanting to note that even if a wonder does stone nothing, they can often be useful to build for, in the case of the ancient wonders, the legacy path for culture, but also in the case of just generally +1 adjacency on a whole bunch of different buildings does generate you a lot of yields over the course of a game, especially if you have really, really strong adjacencies like Rome's unique quarter, which has a adjacency for influence that can be very, very strong. And I do think that they get bonus towards wonders specifically on that influence, and so this will be useful. So, without further ado, let's get into it with the Angkor Wat, which is going to be getting a construction bonus from the Kumai. The Angkor Wat gives you +1 specialist in this city, or specialist limit, and +3 happiness. In general, we won't get into unpacking the metagame, but I think that it is very weak to be going for 1 mega city and a whole bunch of towns, and that is this context in which you are drying up completely your useful specialist slots with adjacencies and having to put specialists in something like ageless buildings. And so within the context of a bunch of medium cities generally being better than a really tall city, and a bunch of towns because food is weak and it's exponential in terms of cost rather than linear, so shipping food to one place just to run into a brick wall of pop growth speed, I do think that this is going to be, instead you're looking at it from the perspective of yields, which is that you have maybe a city with +5 adjacency for mountains, or +3 to 4 adjacencies on a single tile for resources, and then you get to really juice up that tile, and so over the course of a game it can generate you additional yields because you put a library right next to 4 resources, and so instead of being a +2 library, you get a +4 library, and then you put specialists down and you can slot in 1 extra specialist on that super juice tile, and that is how you get the extra value out of the Angkor Wat. Generally speaking, we're going to put it in C tier. It is going to be a little bit inconsistent because unless you have an ageless quarter, you're not going to be getting these yields always, and you will need to overbuild over your district that you had constructed. Let's say it's a library, and you'll need to put like a university on there in the next age in order to revive the adjacency bonus of the specialists that are housed there. Alright, next up, tied to Carthage, in terms of construction speed, we have the Byrsa. I'm not sure how it's pronounced 100%, but this will give 2 gold, and trade routes from the city cannot be pillaged. I think that this is, generally speaking, going to, most of the time, just kind of generate you 2 gold. The AI doesn't seem that good at pillaging trade routes to begin with. I think that piling a bunch of trade routes in one city, I'm not 100% sure if Jade applies to trade routes. If it does, then that can be a strategy you want to do, in which case building a Byrsa in there is very good. But I think that intentionally getting all your merchants to come out from one city in order to run all the trade routes from that city is, you might have the opportunity cost, or you might be giving up getting those trade routes earlier if you were just buying merchants, and buying merchants closer to where the trade route you want to put in is. And if that's the case, you'd have to consider losing the extra yields versus having your thing be not rateable, this type of stuff. Overall, I think this is a really weird or weak wonder, and it's generally not going to make up its value. Next up, we have the Colosseum, which is, of course, tied to Rome, and this will generate a 3 culture and then 2 happiness for every quarter. I think in the early game, this will get you, 2 to 4 happiness. In the late game, it'll get you something like 8 to 12. I think that generally speaking, that happiness stacked in one city isn't as good as happiness spread out, because happiness is really good when you're running a deficit, because every negative happiness gives you minus 2% all yields, although I'm not 100% sure if it applies to happiness. And so getting out from that is really good. And also having happiness everywhere is good for going over the settlement limit. But since it's all located in one kind of place, it's going to be like low value happiness. So we're going to put it in B tier. It can generate a decent amount of yields over the course of a game. Maybe kind of a little bit better on civilizations that are looking to have more golden ages or are golden age reliant, or leaders rather, but we are going to have it in B tier here. Next up, we have the Colosseum, which is the first of kind of this category of wonder that is really, really strong. The Colossus gives plus 3 gold. It gives plus 3 slots for buildings, or for resources rather, and then it gives, very importantly, a economic attribute point. And the economic attribute point is really, really kind of what you're after here. I think that generally speaking, if you're playing with going for a lot of cities, you won't have trouble finding slots for your resources, and that generally speaking, coastal cities are not necessarily going to be the place you want to stack a bunch of resources anyways, so the resource slots aren't that good. 3 gold per turn isn't that good, but it's not nothing. But the economic attribute point in the late game will represent, if you finish out the whole tree, it represents 5% extra gold, or it represents moving along through the tree a little bit faster. And so we are going to put this pretty snugly in A tier. I do think other attribute points are quite a bit better than the economic one, but I still think it is really, really solid. Next up, we have the Dur-Sharrukin, which acts as a fortified district, and it gives plus 3 combat strength to fortified districts in all settlements. This one is maybe really good in multiplayer. I think in single player, you're generally, if you find yourself in early antiquity, this is the spot in terms of military that's the most scary, and there's no way that building a wonder is better than building units if you find yourself in that really scary spot. And so I think functionally it is often going to just not be that useful, unless you're finding yourself fighting a defensive war in some spot in like exploration age. I don't think that it'll come up that often. Maybe this is like reverse win more, where it's like a lose less wonder, and in that context is really good. And maybe I'm underappreciating the fact that some civilizations are going to have a bunch of fortifications, like China, just incidentally as a result of building into it, or someone who got hill forts off of their suzerain in the ancient age, this type of thing, and then they have a fort. Maybe you're playing the soon to be released the Balkan nation. I forget the name of the Balkan nation. I want to say Bosnia, but I'm pretty sure it's Serbia. So something like that, but I think just generally it's going to often just be kind of a dead wonder, and so we're going to put it in D tier. Next up, we have the Emile Bell. It's not associated with any country. It unlocks the ginseng agreement, which gives you like food in the capital, which is not a worthwhile endeavor, but it gives you a Diplo attribute point. And the Diplo attribute point is a really weird one, because the first and second Diplo attribute points are really good, and then they're not good until you get to the end tier repeatable one, which gives you 3% all yields per alliance. Now, I'm not 100% sure if you get that for city-states. I don't think you do. If you do, then this should probably be rated higher than where I'm going to put it. But in particular, I think that this is polarized in the sense that if you have a diplomatic attribute point, or can get one, or find your way into building this relatively early, getting 2 Diplo attribute points so that you can suzerain for cheaper, I think is really, really good timing. The problem is, in the exploration age, you can basically guarantee yourself by doing well in terms of the culture legacy path and building wonders, and choosing to get 2 Diplo points so that you can get suzerains cheaper if you're playing in that way. And so I think that this will be really polarized, and maybe kind of good if you can get it in the ancient era and get more suzerains as a consequence, but is often just going to be, okay, we got a Diplo attribute point, now we don't need to spend as much on cultural attribute points in the transition of the exploration age, so it effectively gives a cultural attribute point. But there's going to be a lot of games where I think a cultural attribute point is better in the very early kind of ages, because if you go for one extra influence yield, in terms of what you get as your first point on the diplomatic attribute tree, that's not as good as one culture in all settlements, which is what you get at the culture one. So I think it'll be a little bit inconsistent, but solid enough. All right, next up we have the Gate of All Nations, which is associated with Persia specifically. They get a construction bonus, and this one's really hard to evaluate because I think that it, generally speaking, has a really in situations where something bad happens, it is really, really nice and useful, which is if you get decks and you're not prepared for it, getting the extra war support is really nice. If you can't support supporting yourself in that war, it's going to effectively generate happiness in all settlements, right? And it's also, if you end up supporting a war multiple times, like let's say 4 times, it gets more expensive each time. What this effectively saves you is your 2 most expensive expenditures that you would have made in terms of the amount of influence it generates. So I think over the course of an age, if you think it saves you 300 influence, and the age is only, 100 turns or whatever, that's 3 influence a turn, which is a very solid yield, and also may save you happiness as well, but will also just give you combat strength in general if you are conducting wars. But you need for wars to have to be good for this to be especially good, but still, this is going to be the only wonder we put in A or S tier that's not giving you an attribute point. I do think it's good. I think it has a low floor, because if you just don't fight, it's not doing anything, and if you had overwhelming strength in a war anyways, it's not effectively acting as an upgrade. But I do think that in spots where it's good, it is really, really, really good, and so we're going to put it in A tier. Next up, we have the one that I have no idea how to pronounce, the Ha'amunga Maui, which gives 2 culture, plus 1 culture and food on fishing ships in the settlement. That part's not that good, but it also gives a cultural attribute point. Generally speaking, I think the culture and scientific attribute points are going to be some of the better ones to get at like the end of the ancient era, which will really help you to lock in your codices and your ability to get wonders and this type of thing. I think that it is going to be, although this is a really late wonder though, so maybe less so on the cultural one, but I do think that it is going to generally in age perform really well, and out of age the cultural attribute point and the science attribute points are both going to be particularly strong, and so we are going to put it up in S tier. Next up we have the Great Stele, which is associated with Axum. Axum is going to be, this is one of the reasons I like Axum, but this is going to be a really polarized wonder, in that I think if you are playing something like Axum, where you get the extra production, and you can first wonder capital, build the Great Stele, it will be absolutely bananas in the Ancient Age specifically, and maybe is deserving of being in the A tier or even S tier, in the context where it's really, really ridiculously good looking. And I think that a lot of the times, other countries will just beat you to this wonder, and it's not worth giving up the settler for, or just as a result of the way you need to play, you're not going to get it first city, first wonder. And so I know I said context, we weren't going to think of things in terms of context, but I think that on average, this isn't going to be your first wonder. And I think that within the average of what it's going to be, very often you'll get 1 or 2 hits on this in the ancient era. That'll be like 400 gold. It's definitely not nothing, but into the later ages it scales and basically only provides adjacencies, because 200 gold in the modern era is just not very good. I do think that this one's maybe a little bit polarized, and maybe I'm going to underrate it, but I'm going to put it into C tier, just because sometimes it's the only wonder you build in the city, and then it's just 200 gold and some adjacencies, and gold is kind of a much weaker yield than something like culture, and like the Colosseum is at least going to be giving you culture every turn for the rest of the game and this type of thing. Next up we have one that I'm feeling like I might underrate a little bit, and I feel a weird way about it. It's going to be the Hanging Gardens, which is going to give you 1 growth on farms in the settlement. That part's not particularly relevant, but it will also give you 10% growth in cities and an expansionist attribute point. Now, I think that with the way the tree is, on the expansionist tree specifically, after the fourth point, I think it is, extra points in the expansionist attribute point tree are just not very good. But getting to the point where you get a refund on your food on specialists and the lower specialist maintenance, I do think that that is kind of okay, solidish, and that you can view the 10% growth in cities, which you want to have a lot of cities, as a bit of, how should I say this? It's going to be an effectively, in terms of the math, spreadsheet warning, in terms of the math, it's going to allow you to push back the point at which you have a growth event which takes longer than 50 turns. It's going to push it back on average like maybe a half a pop. So if we take into the growth bonus and we could put in 10%, you will see that it's shifted down slightly. And if we take a look at this 10 here in the ancient era, we have 10, 43 turns to grow. And then if we do this, instead it's 47. So it's not pushing it down entirely, but it's going to effectively, if you are starting to approach the wall in the later periods of the age, it's going to make it so that you can push through just a little bit, and an extra third to half a pop per city is actually pretty good if you think of it in terms of yields, and relative to other ones. And so this will be really good, but the expansionist attribute point I think is not necessarily that good, nor is getting it exactly at that timing especially good. This is so hard for me to rate. I think we're going to put it in, we're going to change our rating from like our spreadsheet here. We're going to put this in the top of S tier with like a low degree of confidence, because I think the expansionist attribute point is worse than a cultural attribute point. But I think that its secondary bonus of all the attribute point wonders is going to be the best. And next up, we have the other one that I feel some kind of strange way, and that's the Mausoleum of Theodoric, which is going to give you 3 production, plus 100% yields, and HP from pillaging, and the militaristic attribute point. This one, from a timing perspective, I think is really good, because I think what you want going in the exploration age, you are specifically pushing treasure fleets, and so you want to be able to get out settlements very quickly for pushing those treasure fleets. Happiness in all your locations would allow you to go over the limit, but in particular, the third militaristic attribute point slot gives you an extra settlement limit. You might not, as a result of events, get a militaristic attribute point, but if you got 2 on the militaristic legacy path, then with this additional point here from the Wonder, you can guarantee that you get that extra settlement limit, and incidentally, +1 war support on all wars for the first militaristic attribute point. So it is going to be doing effectively the half of Gate of All Nations for the very first point, and so the first point will be fairly solid as well. I do think that this is, because of the timing, going to be like kind of S tier. But it's going to have the same issue with after the third point. I think that the militaristic attribute points are not very good, and they kind of share a path with the expansionist attribute points, in that when you go to a new age and you have the opportunity to spend legacy points on attribute points, you can use the same resource for both. I feel really weird about my placement on these. I would not hate having them both in A tier, and I would not hate having them both at the top of S tier. I'm super not confident in this, but in either case, they're in one of the 2 tiers, and they're both going to be very, very solid. For whatever reason, I don't want to put them at the back of S tier. I think either you care about the attribute point being worse by a lot, or you don't, and you care about the thing that is also giving in the other ways. Incidentally, pillaging is also kind of nice, the extra HP from pillaging. That's like a non-zero thing. Next up, we have the Monk's Mound, which is tied to the Mississippians. This is going to give you 4 food and 4 resource capacity. This is good maybe on Carthage. I think that, generally speaking, the extra resource, it's not going to be useful because you want to go all cities and you don't have a problem with resource slots, generally speaking, and that 4 food is a terrible yield, so we're going to put it in D tier. Yeah. And next up, we are going to have the Mundo Perdido, which is tied to the Meier, gives you +1 happiness and +1 science on tropical tiles in this settlement. This is going to be really polarized in terms of how good it is. It will occasionally be really good, and then sometimes you will not be able to find a single city where it will do actually anything other than just sit there and be a legacy path, improvement point towards the 7 wonders you need to build, or just be an adjacency kind of farm. We're going to put it in C tier because sometimes it's really good. Next up, we have the Nalanda. The Nalanda gives 3 science, it gives 1 codex, it has 2 codices slots, and it gives a scientific attribute point. The 1 codex is pretty nice because if you had you will very often have not enough codices kind of picked up here and there, and getting the Nalanda becomes an absolute must. I also do think the scientific attribute point is worth more than the cultural one. We're going to put this up in S tier, and we are going to have the very awkward situation, which is like, I don't really know how to order these in S tier, of these 4, rather, but this is going to be the ordering we choose with a very low degree of confidence. Next up, we have the Oracle. The Oracle is tied to Greece and gives +2 culture, and when gaining rewards from a narrative event, gain an additional 10 culture per age. So this gives yields that are scaling, which is pretty nice, and I think they scale harder than like Greece's or something like this, or sorry, the Colosseum or something like this, where you are going to be getting but the problem is Colosseum gives it every turn. This gives it intermittently. I don't really know how many narrative events happen on average per turn, and if I knew this, I would be able to rate the Oracle a lot better, but I do think that they happen at least every 10 turns. And if this is generating, 3 culture per turn, or 4 culture a turn, or 5 culture a turn, that's a kind of decent yield, decent-ish yield. If it's generating, 5, 9, and, math is hard. If it's generating, if you have an event every 5 turns, right? And you will be getting 10 culture, or 20 culture, or 30 culture every 5 turns, then it starts to look pretty decent in terms of yields. I don't think you quite get one every 5 turns. I think maybe it's more frequent than every 10 turns. I don't really know exactly. We're going to put it back here in C tier. Although it will be maybe a little bit more consistent than the Angkor Wat. I think the Angkor Wat can probably generate more yields per turn, though, and so we're going to have it back in C tier. Next up, we have the Petra. Petra is really conditional. It gives a +1 gold on desert tiles and +1 production on desert tiles. This is going to be... it also gives 2 flat gold. I think occasionally this is just really, really bonkers, but is often really hard to find a spot for. And so I think that we're going to put it in C tier. But in particular, it's really, really nice if it's really, really good in your particular settlement. And so it's really like having one settlement just pop off really hard. And occasionally it's going to be like an A tier type of performance. But I think it's just wildly consistent and often super, super dead. Next up, we're going to have Pyramid of the Sun. It gives +3 culture and +3 culture on each quarter in this settlement. I think this will be very consistent at generating yields, and it will also generate quite a bit more yields than the Colosseum in terms of value. I think culture is a little bit better than happiness. It's also giving +3 instead of, I think Colosseum gives +2 happiness per, and so this is just going to be generating quite a lot of science or culture. I think in the early ages it maybe generates in total, including the 3 base, like 9 a turn, and then in the later ages maybe you're like at 18 a turn, and so it does kind of scale a little bit nicely. Next up, we have the pyramids, which is kind of like a bad version of the Petra. They give +1 production and gold on navigable rivers in the settlement. I think generally speaking you don't want to work navigable rivers, and also you probably can have more desert tiles than navigable rivers generally in a settlement, and that also you will want to build quarters and districts over the navigable rivers, and so to the extent you were working them, eventually they get bricked, although in the early ages, if you're playing like someone like Egypt, this is absolutely bananas on Egypt, and incidentally, Egyptian does have a bonus towards pyramids, but we're going to put this down into D tier. Alright, next up we have the Sanchi Stupa, which is associated with the Moria. This gives 2 happiness and 1 culture for excess happiness in the settlement. This is going to be pretty polarized in terms of how useful it is. If you are stacking happiness in some sort of way, this is going to be pretty nice. It gives plus 1 culture for every 5 excess happiness, sorry. But I think that you're going to have a hard time generating anywhere near as much yields as, like, this palace, where it's, like, 15. If you're, like, plus 40 in a city because you are really, really pushing it, you know, this is going to represent 8 additional culture and the 2 happiness. So, like, the yields aren't really that good, and it's also kind of hard to be achieving that. We're going to put this into C tier. Next up, we are going to have the Terracotta Army, which gives plus 2 production. It grants a free army commander when built and gives 25% army experience. This is a little bit hard to kind of rate, but in particular, I think that having 2 commanders going into the next age is pretty strong. And I suppose if you build the second one, this would be a 3rd commander. It's really difficult to rate how good experience is, but a lot of having an additional marginal level on your commanders. I wish I knew how much experience translated, or like how it scaled, if it scaled linearly or like exponentially. But we're gonna rate this as being a little bit better than some of these high yield kind of wonders here, which we think of the Colosseum and the Palace as being high yield ones. And so I think that an extra commander and extra juice on the commander is probably better, but maybe I'm overvaluing this relative to the yields, because you get this and it's useful if you're in a war, and it's useful specifically in a war that you would not otherwise win, where it kind of turns the side of the war, or a war you need to finish faster for whatever reason. And if you can have a sort of slow war and you are winning it anyways, then having a war bonus is a lot less useful than having yields, because yields will always be the yields. And so, okay. Next up, we have the Weiyang Palace. It's associated with the Han. It is the simplest wonder. It just gives 6 influence. This is pretty good on the yields, especially in the Ancient Age. Influence is really, really good. And so I think that we are going to be putting it in B tier, with the idea that in the Ancient Age, it's going to be a really nice high yield building, but it doesn't scale well later. And the Colosseum and the Sun Palace, or Pyramid of the Sun, rather, are going to be scaling better into the sort of ancient era, or into the later periods of time, but not as good in the ancient era. And this is the tier list we have. I'm just to kind of go back over it. We have the 6 attribute point wonders, which I think scale really well into the late game and are really good the instant you put them on. In particular, the science and cultural ones, if it's your first point and you have 6 settlements, that will just give you 6 culture or 6 science. And also, you'll have the attribute point scaling towards the next era. It's like the Pyramid of the Sun is maybe going to give you 6 or 9 culture, and then you don't have the attribute point. So I really do rate these quite highly. I think the science and culture ones are best for the attribute point alone, and then how much you value kind of the secondary effects here are going to really determine whether or not you kind of value this. I think the timing window of the militaristic one, and that sometimes this guarantees your ability to get the extra settlement limit, I think that is really good in particular, and that the Hanging Gardens does have the best bonus alongside you also receiving an attribute point, but that an expansionist attribute point will tend to fall off in the modern era, and you'll often have an attribute point that gets dead between having a 3 militaristic attribute point and already grabbing the good specialist attribute points, or feels relatively dead. But maybe it's just good enough in the earlier ages, in that exploration age, to be having the additional food refund from specialists, as well as food maintenance on specialists, something like this. Gate of All Nations, the only one I think that makes it up here that does not have an attribute point. Next up, we have the B tier, which has kind of got the extra army from Terracotta, and then really high yield wonders. And then C tier, we have kind of medium-ish tier or medium yield wonders, and also the obelisk, which is really explosive and is conditionally are in some games really, really strong. And then next up, we have just the wonders that just feel like they don't do anything like whatsoever, and that's kind of going to be D tier for us. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe. You know, do the YouTube algorithm thing, hit the notification bell, and other than that, have a good one.